Today is Sunday, 1st September, start of a new month in the Ukrainian conflict, and one where the auguries suggest it's going to be at least as bad as August was, with the US election drawing ever closer and the problems for Ukraine and perhaps also for the Western alliance multiplying as well. One senses, by the way, that there are also doubts and uncertainties as to how to proceed in Moscow. I suspect that some people there are already trying to stay ahead of events on the battlefields, which probably are taking them by surprise and which may force them before very long to change their own perspectives about how the conflict should be resolved. Anyway, before dealing with the various discussions that have been taking place in the West, in the United States specifically, and in Britain perhaps, because of course I live here, and in Russia too, let me go to a discussion of the situation on the battlefronts. But before I do, I'm going to mention what is perhaps the single most important piece of news that we've had over the last 24 hours. And that is information which is coming from CNN that the United States has refused Ukraine's request to authorize the use of long-range missiles in attacks on Russia. The CNN article, which is sourced to various senior officials in the United States, well, it relates ultimately to the visit of the Ukrainian defense minister, Rustem Umerov, and an interview which he gave to CNN following his meetings with the United States authorities, specifically with US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. Though I notice, interestingly, that Lloyd Austin's name is not actually mentioned in this CNN article. Now, I ought to quickly add that at the same time that Umerov was meeting Lloyd Austin, Yermak, who is Zelensky's chief of staff, was meeting with Jake Sullivan, who is President Biden's national security advisor. And interestingly, Sullivan met Yermak in the company of the national security advisors of Britain, France, and Germany. All of them presumably had gathered together with Sullivan for this meeting. So Yermak faced a rather powerful group of Western officials drawn from all of the main Western countries, the most powerful, at least the most powerful Western countries. And that meeting, we've not been told very much about, save that the US again made promises to take action to try to stabilize Ukraine's air defense situation by transferring still more air defense systems to Ukraine. How that's going to be done, given the shortage in the number of these systems, given the fact that the Russians are able to smash through these systems with their hypersonic missiles and flood them with drones and missiles, and hunt them as well with many Western-supplied air defense systems destroyed. Well, that, of course, is not explained. But I'm going to say straight away that a meeting between Jake Sullivan and the national security advisors of France, Germany, and Britain is not just going to be a discussion about air defense systems. It is an indicator of the extreme concern with which the United States is reviewing the situation in Ukraine and almost certainly it involved political discussions, not perhaps so much about President Zelensky's position. So far, there's no sign that the United States is actively moving to replace him. But perhaps the Americans and their Western allies were looking from the Ukrainians for an assessment of the overall situation and for some indication of what sort of plan the Ukrainians might have given the gathering crisis on the battlefield, not perhaps so much to reverse the situation on the battlefield, but rather to achieve some kind of diplomatic breakthrough that might bring the situation to some kind of a stop so that the conflict won't escalate further and result, as it is increasingly looking like it will do, in a clear-cut Russian victory and Western defeat. So anyway, Yermak was meeting with all of these senior officials, and at the same time as he was meeting with these senior Western officials, of course, amongst whom, of course, Sullivan is by far the most important, Umerov was meeting with Lloyd Austin and with the Pentagon, and he appears to have come up against a very cold reception. Now, this is what CNN tells us happened. UN Defense Minister Rustem Umerov told CNN the Biden administration is still considering his request to lift restrictions on Ukraine using long-range weapons to strike deeper inside Russian territory, and confirmed he'd presented a list of targets in meetings with senior officials in Washington on Friday. We have explained what kind of capabilities we need to protect the citizens against the Russian terror that Russians are causing us. So I hope we were heard, Umerov said. Despite repeated requests from Ukrainian President Zelensky, the US is not currently expected to loosen restrictions on Ukraine's use of long-range army tactical missile systems, ATACMS. You've heard us say, and this is a quote from Major General Pat Ryder, who's the Pentagon Press Secretary, you've heard us say that the Ukrainians can use US security assistance to defend themselves from cross-border attacks, in other words, counter-fire. But as it relates to long-range strike, deep strikes into Russia, our policy has not changed. That's from Major General Pat Ryder. And then we're told Ukraine only has a limited supply of US-provided long-range missiles, and the US has made it clear that Kiev should not expect another significant delivery of ATACMS because of the finite number in US inventories and the long production time of the weapon, according to a US official. So this is a US official who is anonymously briefing CNN. So the United States has in effect decided that it is not going to supply any more ATACMS, or at least it's not going to do so in any significant quantities. There's not that many of them, and production of them is slow. I'm going to repeat my own view. I believe the production of ATACMS missiles is non-existent. I don't believe that the United States has been producing any entirely new ATACMS systems as opposed to adaptations of existing systems since 2006. Anyway, the article then goes on to say, speaking before the meeting between Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Umerov, the US official said many of Ukraine's high-value targets in Russia are outside the range of ATACMS. Russia's military has pulled its high-value military assets far away from the front line, including the aircraft launching glide bombs that have wreaked havoc on Ukrainian targets. Anyway, Umerov then pushed back against this, but I suspect the whole tone of the article suggests that he got a stony reception from the US and that the Americans, for the moment, remain not merely unconvinced, but increasingly hostile. And there is a further report which says that the administration does not intend to make any further appropriation requests on behalf of Ukraine to Congress over the remaining period of its existence, which of course ends in January. What the successor president might decide to do, and I'm not going to discuss now who that might be, well, that of course is a different matter. But over the next few months, even as a large part of the appropriation has now been spent, it doesn't seem as if the administration is looking to supply any more, is going to seek from Congress any more authority to spend more money on Ukraine. Apparently, allegedly, supposedly, all new funding for Ukraine is to be provided from the $50 billion loan, which the Americans and the Europeans are trying to cobble together, which is a loan that will be floated on the international financial markets, with the bondholders being reassured that they will be paid from the interest of Russia's frozen assets, and with the European states supposedly providing guarantees. As I understand that as of this moment, further progress on sorting out the problems with this loan are proving intractable, and we are not yet anywhere close to the problems relating to this loan being settled. So it looks as if, I mean, these are of course early reports, it looked as if Umerov had received a stony reception. And one of the reasons is that it seems that the individual who, despite having an apparently rocky relationship, personal relationship with Zelensky, President Zelensky, the individual who, in my opinion, has been the main driver of US support for Ukraine throughout the period of the last 2.5 years, is now effectively sidelined. There was an article by Gerard Baker in the London Times, which I believe echoes comments made by a senior Australian politician, commenting upon the fact that the President of the United States, Joe Biden, no longer seems to be playing any significant role in the government of the United States, that he has essentially withdrawn from the scene. Apparently he spent some part of August at the residence of a wealthy friend of his in California. He spent further time on the beach. He's enjoying, in other words, a long, and as he would no doubt say, a well-deserved rest. And of course, let's be frank, summer is a time when most people go on holiday. But of course, the President of the United States is never strictly on holiday, or at least not in theory, because without him, without the input that comes from him, the American government is not able to work efficiently. But in this case, it seems that a holiday, a prolonged holiday, lasting perhaps all the way to January, is what the president has elected to take. And in the meantime, various individual officials, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, all sorts of officials are basically operating on autopilot, making their own decisions as best they can without the president apparently being there to guide them. At least that was what that article by Gerard Baker said. So without the president overruling objections from the Pentagon, from US officials. There is no one left now to do that. And the result is that the Pentagon, which is apparently extremely frustrated and exasperated with the whole affair, with apparently some US officials in the Pentagon complaining that the Biden administration, the president, has consistently, repeatedly failed to abide by his own red lines in terms of the assistance that he's been prepared to authorize for Ukraine. Anyway, the mood in the Pentagon seems to have hardened, and a decision has been made for the moment not to provide the long-range missiles. Well, of course, nothing in the world of Washington is forever. This is the decision, it seems, as of today. Of course, by tomorrow, that decision may have been completely reversed. But it seems that even in Britain, where there's been strong advocacy, public advocacy, from the British government for the supply of missiles, not just for the supply of missiles to Ukraine, but for authorization to Ukraine to launch these missiles in deep strikes against Russia. It seems that there's been pushback, and I've been reading again in the London Times a long article by Dominic Lawson, who believes that authorization to launch missiles against Russia should be provided. Anyway, I read in this long article by Dominic Lawson the following comment. Labour's Security Minister Dan Jarvis, who by the way has a military background, one of the very few people in Labour Party politics who does. Anyway, Labour Security Minister Dan Jarvis warned that Britain must be incredibly careful to avoid retaliation from Moscow. And of course, we know that a couple of weeks ago, when David Cameron, first the former Foreign Secretary, floated the idea of Ukraine using Storm Shadow missiles to carry out missile strikes inside Russia, we remember that the Russians called in the British ambassador and warned the British ambassador that if anything like that happened, the Russians would retaliate against Britain and would consider themselves to be at liberty to retaliate against any British military assets anywhere in the world, including by implication in Britain itself. Anyway, there we are. That seems to be the position at the moment. For the moment, that prohibition on using missiles to conduct deep strikes into Russia is holding. It does seem as if the Pentagon is opposed to this idea. It seems that even some people in London understand that this would be a dangerous escalation, going beyond, for the first time rather, actually crossing a real Russian red line. So anyway, that's the situation. Now, I would say that there is a current thought, I've seen it in several places, that it's because the West is not allowing missile strikes deep inside Russia, that is what has caused the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk to fail. I think that is completely wrong. I don't think the one has any connection with the other. I think that the kind of missiles, the number of missiles that Ukraine could launch, and the failure of those missiles that it has launched to do any significant damage to the Russian military system, given the effectiveness of Russia's air defense system and the enormous size of the country. Well, in my opinion, given all of that, there is really no possibility that launching missile strikes deep inside Russia is going to make any difference on the battlefronts, and I don't think it's made any difference to the battlefronts in Kursk region at all. Anyway, let's put that aside and let's talk about the actual military events over the last 24 hours. Well, the first thing to say is that over the last 24 hours, Ukraine has launched its biggest ever drone attack on Russia. Apparently something like 150 drones were launched by Ukraine against Russian territory. There's no doubt that some have got through and have done damage to elements of the Russian energy system. There's been reports, for example, that one drone has hit some kind of power station somewhere in Russia. To repeat again, these are pinprick attacks. The sheer scale of Russia's energy system is colossal, and it is also incredibly hardened, and by now, of course, its key parts of it will be protected by the Russian air defense system. Ukraine, again, is expending a huge amount of time and energy, and to some extent resources, on these drone attacks. They will make the odd bang and create clouds of smoke. They might result in energy shortages in one or two places. They might tragically result in the deaths of a few people in a few places, but they will not change in any way the outcome of the war, or indeed developments on the battlefronts. The Russians, by the way, have also been busy in the air. They've been launching drone and missile and attacks and artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions. There's reports that a major convoy of Ukrainian vehicles, 22 of them, was destroyed in an attack by Russian multiple launch rocket systems in Sumy region, supposedly providing supplies to the Ukrainian forces in Kursk. Perhaps, probably, that is true. The Ukrainians, for the record, say that these were civilian vehicles carrying grain. I'm not there. I don't know. I'm not going to rush and hand out guesses. But anyway, one convoy was destroyed, and I've seen pictures over the last couple of hours of massive bomb explosions in Sumy and Kharkiv region, and by the way, heavy bombing of other places, Chasiv Yar and Vuhledar, which we will come to shortly. And perhaps to round up on this, Ukraine has also carried out missile strikes on the Russian city of Belgorod. Again, it's not at all clear what exactly Ukraine was striking at in Belgorod. The Russians are saying that this is a civilian residential areas, that these were multiple launch rocket systems, that they weren't guided missiles or anything of that kind. In other words, they say that it's a terror attack, and for all I know it is. The point is that, again, putting aside the damage and the death and tragedy that this attack causes, it is ultimately pointless, because it will not change in any way the direction of the war or the pace of events. And perhaps the most dramatic news over the last 24 hours is that, with reports that the 72nd Brigade, an elite brigade of the Ukrainian army, the one that has garrisoned Vuhledar for several years and which has successfully repelled attacks on Vuhledar in southern Donbass, with reports that the 72nd Brigade has been withdrawn from Vuhledar and that the defense of Vuhledar has been taken up by second-tier troops, a medley of battalions. Anyway, with those reports, there are now reports that the Russians have launched a head-on attack on Vuhledar, just as they sensed a weakness in the defences in Toretsk, which was supposed to have been impregnable. They sensed that the best military units had been withdrawn by Ukraine from Toretsk to other places, given the enormous stress on the Ukrainian military across the front lines. And the Russians, capitalizing on that, launched their attack on Toretsk and captured all kinds of places like New York and other places around Toretsk, and have now broken into Toretsk itself. So, in the same way, the Russians are now capitalizing on the withdrawal of the 72nd Brigade and have launched a head-on attack on Vuhledar. And there are, in fact, reports this morning, which, of course, I cannot confirm, that the Russians have actually broken into Vuhledar, that Vuhledar is in the process of being stormed by the Russian army. This fortress town, about 14,000 people, made up almost exclusively of easily defended high-rise buildings, which dominates the landscape, the very flat landscape, steppe land. Anyway, this fortified town is apparently being stormed, and there are some suggestions that over the next couple of days even, it might actually finally fall. Now, there's been inevitably a lot of criticism in Ukraine and amongst various commentators about the decision to withdraw the 72nd Brigade from Vuhledar. I'm going to push back. I'm going to say that, again, obviously, I say all of this without having any degree of military background or experience or knowledge. But in my opinion, for once, the Ukrainian High Command has made absolutely the correct decision. With the fall of Konstantinovka, with the imminent Russian attack on the village of ODYSEE, with the roads to Vuhledar being in the process of being cut, the main road, supply road, has already been cut. The next supply road has almost been reached by the Russian army. It looked as if Vuhledar was on the brink of being completely surrounded. And I cannot see the logic of keeping one of Ukraine's best brigades surrounded inside a fortress which can never be relieved. Far more important to save the men and the brigade and to position them somewhere so that they can fight another day than to lose them all in Vuhledar, which is going to be lost anyway. So that is my own completely amateur assessment of this decision. I think that whoever made the decision, Syrskyi or Zelensky or someone else, for once made the correct decision to pull the 72nd Brigade out of Vuhledar. At this point in the conflict, preserving one of Ukraine's few remaining intact elite brigades surely takes priority over clinging on to a place like Vuhledar, which is certain to fall in a few weeks anyway. Now, that doesn't, of course, alter the fact that if Vuhledar is indeed captured by the Russians over the next couple of days or weeks, it will be a major psychological blow in Ukraine. A whole mythology has been created around Vuhledar about how it was the invincible fortress against which the Russians had broken their teeth on several occasions. I say mythology, but it's mythology with a strong dose of truth. So the announcement, the confirmation that Vuhledar has finally fallen will be a blow. It will also, its capture by the Russians will also simplify significantly Russian logistics. It will mean that the Russians are able to reopen railway lines which have been within artillery range of Vuhledar, simplifying their logistics in southern Donbass. And it will probably mean that the Russians will be able to advance further towards Kurakovo itself. And in time, they may be able to open another front from the south towards Pavlograd and the Dnieper. So one shouldn't underestimate the significance for the Russians of the capture of Vuhledar. But to reiterate, all of that would have happened anyway. The Ukrainians, if they tried to defend Vuhledar, would still have found themselves in exactly the same situation, except that they would not have had the 72nd Brigade to try to at least slow it. Now, as to the whereabouts of the 72nd Brigade, I have absolutely no idea. I, however, did suggest yesterday that possibly it has been redeployed to Selydove. Yesterday, there were reports that the Russians, who currently occupy, according to some reports, around a quarter of Selydove, were being counterattacked by the Ukrainians inside Selydove. According to the same Russian reports, the Russians had repelled those counterattacks, and they are redeploying more forces and are preparing to go on the attack in Selydove again at some point within the next couple of days. Now, it could be that it is the 72nd Brigade that has been deployed to the Selydove area and which is fighting there. And it could be that it was the presence of the 72nd Brigade that prevented the immediate collapse in Selydove and has slowed the Russians down in that particular town. But let me stress again, this is just my own conjecture. I don't even know for a fact that there has been a Ukrainian counterattack in Selydove. Maybe the Russians are still advancing in Selydove. Who knows? But all I will say is that the presence of the 72nd Brigade in Selydove would not surprise me. And the fact that the Russians are themselves talking about Ukrainian counterattacks does suggest to me that, for the moment at least, in Selydove, they have been slowed. Now, however, and having said all of this, there is bitter fighting going on in the area south of Selydove, and there is a huge amount of discussion as to what this means exactly. There are reports that the Russians have pushed south from the village of Galitsinivka, which they captured yesterday, as I discussed in my program, that they've now launched an assault upon another village to the south of Galitsinivka, which is called Zelanye Pershe. There is further south, immediately below this village, another village called Zelanye Duche. It seems that the Russians could be trying to capture both of these places. And there's also a small town in this area called Girnik, and it might be that the Russians are trying to capture all of those places too. Now, this is all being explained by reference to this great cauldron operation that the Russians are supposedly trying to conduct in the area south of Karlovka and Netailovo, and to the east of Galitsinivka, and to the north of Krasnogorovka, and to the west of Novolskoye. All places now, note, that the Russians basically control. That supposedly up to 3 Ukrainian brigades are located in these fields, and several thousand men, and that if the Russians are able to capture Zelanye Pershe and Zelanye Ducha, and if the Russians are able to continue their advance westwards from Krasnogorovka and are able to advance further and faster than admittedly up to now they have been doing, then these 3 Ukrainian brigades in these fields will be surrounded and will find themselves in a cauldron. And that will be a cauldron in which several thousand Ukrainian troops are trapped. Now, I find this absolutely astonishing. I find this completely bizarre. I do not understand for the life of me why Ukraine would be keeping large numbers of men in open fields where they were already surrounded by the Russians from 3 sides. Perhaps there's some kind of military logic to this, but if there is, it entirely escapes me. And assuming that the Ukrainians really are in these fields, in these sort of numbers, I have to say that I also think that this supposed Russian encirclement operation, this attempt by the Russians to capture Zelanya Pershe and Zelanya Duche and to advance further to try to trap these Ukrainian forces with a further advance of the south from Krasnogorovka. It looks to me all very, very complicated and very ambitious, and I wonder whether it's really practical. Just saying. Having said that, I have to admit it isn't just Russian sources who are talking in this way. Ukrainian sources are talking about this also, and it's even managed to reach parts of the Western media as well, that there is a large Ukrainian force trapped in these fields west of Nevolskoye and south of Karlovka and Etailovo and Pervomaisky and north of Krasnogorovka, and that they are now at very serious risk of becoming encircled. If this does indeed happen, then it would be a comment, in my opinion, on the complete incompetence of the Ukrainian command, that it has left such a large force of troops in fields, open fields, where they can be surrounded in this way. It makes no sense to me, but then what do I know? Perhaps there's some kind of military logic here, which completely escapes me. But anyway, there we go. So this major unfolding operation playing out south of the highway, and there are also suggestions that the ultimate objective of the Russians is not even Pokrovsk, but to push on to capture presumably Ukrainsk and Girnik and Kurachovka, and to link up with the forces that are advancing from Krasnogorovka, which of course the Russians basically captured a few weeks ago, and also the Russian forces that are advancing through Maximilianovka from Marinka, and to capture the important town of Kurachovo further to the south. And presumably the intention, the plan to capture Selydove is also part of this major operation, of which, by the way, the capture of Vuhledar would also be a part, to destroy group of forces, the Ukrainian forces in southern Donbass. Now, Kurachovo could be, probably is, a significant Russian objective. Again, it is an important place. It has been an important logistical center. I wonder whether it is really quite as important in the scheme of things as Pokrovsk. And I would have thought that, and it continues to be my belief, that the real explanation for all of these Russian moves is not so much to encircle large numbers of Ukrainian troops which I suspect would be a very difficult and complicated thing to do, or to capture Kurakovo, but rather to secure the highway, the E50 highway, which becomes eventually the MO4 highway from Donetsk, leading all the way north to Pokrovsk, to provide a secure supply route along which the logistical supplies and the reinforcements can be sent to support the advance, the attack on Pokrovsk itself. That seems to me a much more logical explanation of the Russian moves than all of these very complicated encirclement operations that many people are talking about. The Ukrainians themselves have been talking about them, and with signs of growing concern. But as I said, I wonder whether there are really enough Russian troops and whether they can move fast enough to conduct an operation of the kind that is being described. And I do wonder whether there are quite as many Ukrainian troops in these fields west of Novolskoye as some people are saying. Anyway, there we are. That's all I want to say about that operation. Now, there's been a long article in the Daily Telegraph by its correspondent, Roland Oliphant. He's somebody who has been discussing the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine over a long time. He is, like his newspaper, a strong supporter of Ukraine in its various wars. And a couple of weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, three or so weeks ago, just before the Kursk operation got underway, Ukraine's Kursk operation, I remember that he published a long article in the Daily Telegraph, a huge, long analysis talking about Russia's summer offensive having been a failure, that the Russians had admittedly advanced some distance after capturing Avdiivka and Ocheretino, but they'd failed to achieve any major military objective. And then about a week ago, he published another article saying that the Kursk operation had put the Russians on the back foot and had humiliated and embarrassed them and had created a major crisis for them, which they might not be able to solve. Well, now he's come down to earth. And yesterday he published an article with the title, Masterstroke or Folly, Ukraine could pay high price for its Kursk incursion. When you ask a question like masterstroke or folly, question mark, well, that kind of title, in my opinion, answers its own question. Obviously, the Kursk operation was a folly. And then Roland Oliphant goes on to say that the audacious operation has left cities in Donbass exposed to a rapid Russian advance. So the offensive, which I think was 2 or 3 weeks ago, he was saying has failed. Suddenly it's dramatically succeeding. He goes on to admit that the situation is going very fast. He says that the Russians have been pushing slowly towards Pokrovsk ever since they captured the strategic city of Avdiivka, 30 miles to the east, in February. But since Ukraine pulled elite units from Donbass for its incursion into Kursk, the Russian advance has accelerated. And then we have a quote from a commander of a Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance unit. And he says, I've never seen such speed in a Russian advance. It is very rapid. And our problem is the same. We don't have infantry. We don't have enough artillery or shells. We don't have enough drones. The enemy has deployed powerful electronic warfare units. So we sometimes have to launch 10, 12, 15 drones, he means, just to destroy one tank. If one of them was lucky enough to find the first electronic warfare vehicle, we could take out the rest. The situation is very complicated and not in our favor. The most critical thing for us now is the large number of soldiers of the Russian Federation. They outnumber us, I reckon, by at least 5-1. And then he says that, this is Roland Oliphant, that over the past 3 weeks, the Russians have advanced at least 5 miles towards the city, moving along the cutting of a railway line that provides cover for their infantry. By Tuesday, they had captured a third of Novogrodivka, a town astride that railway line. By Friday, Novogrodivka had fallen completely. Battles are ongoing on the left. If you look at the enemy towards Pokrovsk, in an apparent attempt to bypass the suburb of Mirnograd, where the urban environment might slow them down, the commander said. I think this is a reference to Grodivka, that the Battle of Grodivka would enable the Russians, if they wanted to advance towards Pokrovsk, to bypass Mirnograd itself. But of course, it could also refer to attacks on other places, and we will see that it's not just Novogrodivka that Oliphant confirms the Russians have captured. He has other things to say about the Battle of Pokrovsk itself. But this Ukrainian commander, he's saying they're trying to break through this flank, basically along the track to the Pokrovsk, and they're succeeding and very successfully. In other words, they're pushing along the railways. The Russians are advancing along the railways. They're using the railway cuttings and embankments as cover, and that they are pushing forward towards Pokrovsk. And we're told that the Russians could reach Pokrovsk itself by mid-September, and then there's an explanation of what the effect of that would be for Ukraine, the logistical crisis it would create right across Donbass. I've discussed that in many places. And then Roland Oliphant also says the Russians are also expanding their salient on the flanks. On Thursday, fighting was reported on the outskirts of Selydove, a town southeast of Pokrovsk. To the east of the city, on the Ukrainian left, they have entered Krasny Yar. You remember Krasny Yar? And village fairly close to Mirnograd, close to Grodivka, Krasny Yar and Kruty Yar. Well, based on Ukrainian sources, Oliphant has confirmed that there are now Russian troops present in Krasny Yar and Grodivka. These moves threaten encirclement of large chunks of the Ukrainian front to the north around Toretsk and to the south around Kurachovo. In other words, and I'm just finishing off Roland Oliphant's article, the Russians are poised to conquer a significant swathe of Donetsk region, one of their stated war aims, dangerously jeopardizing the remaining Ukrainian footholds and threatening an attack towards Dnipro and the Dnieper River. So that's from Roland Oliphant, and he gives us a good, I think, overall view of the state of the battle. The Russians, I think, are focusing on Pokrovsk. They're using the railway lines for cover as they advance. And here I am at a disadvantage because the maps I'm using do not show the railway lines, which is deeply frustrating, by the way. But anyway, the Russians are advancing rapidly towards Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians expect the battle for Pokrovsk to begin in about 2 weeks' time. And the Russians, according to a Ukrainian soldier, have a 5-to-1 superiority in manpower. Bear in mind that for most of the war, the manpower advantage has been with the Ukrainians. And that, together with the enormous material advantages that the Russians have and their air power, ultimately is what has explained up to now the speed of the Russian advance. So that's Pokrovsk, the Pokrovsk, Selydove area, Karlovka area, all of these places. Vuhledar now also under attack. Major crisis for the Ukrainians in southern central Donbass, the area where General Mordvichev, the commander of Group of Forces Center, perhaps the most talented commander that the Russian army has so far produced, battlefield commander that the Russian army has so far produced in this war so far. Anyway, that's the area where General Mordvichev is in overall charge. And I would say that another important factor in the speed of the Russian advance westwards and in the advance towards Pokrovsk is the way in which, the skill with which Mordvichev has conducted his operations, this operation in this war up to now. Anyway, things could start to look bad in other places as well. Now, we've had some further news from Toretsk, and the latest news from Toretsk is that the Russians have now captured the village of Druzhba, which lies to the northeast of Pivnichne, which the Russian, or Kirovo, as the Russians call it, which the Russian Defense Ministry now says has already been captured. We haven't yet had confirmation of this from the Russian Defense Ministry, but it seems as if Druzhba has also been captured. And there are speculations that the Russians, having captured the Druzhba, are going to advance northwestwards towards two other villages, Dachne and Dilivka. And of course, as we saw, they're also pushing towards villages like Alexandropil, which is located to the west of Toretsk. Anyway, some are seeing all of these different moves by the Russians on the northeast flank of Toretsk and on the western flank of Toretsk as part of a Russian operation, perhaps not so much to encircle Toretsk itself, but to get close to the TO516 road, which is the main supply road linking Toretsk to Konstantinovka, through which Ukraine sends supplies to the forces which are defending Toretsk. Of course, I've already explained that if the Russians cut the road from Pokrovsk itself, I suspect to a great extent they already have, that in itself will prevent supplies going from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka and thereon to Toretsk. But of course, if you cut the road from Konstantinovka to Toretsk, well, the situation becomes critical. And with the Russians already inside Toretsk and gradually, apparently, enlarging the territory that they control in Toretsk, though progress is very slow at the moment, probably because the Russians have been more focused on capturing the outlying villages. Well, with the Russians already in Toretsk, if the supplies start to break down, then obviously Toretsk itself becomes untenable. It seems to me that another possible explanation for the Russian advance towards Druzhba and ultimately Dachny in Dilivka is firstly that the Russians want to make sure that there are no Ukrainian troops positioned on their flanks as they advance within Toretsk itself. They need to cover their flanks, but also possibly to create conditions for an attack on Toretsk from the northeast. We also have Russian troops obviously advancing in this same area from Kurdyumovka. So anyway, probably the Russians are aiming to do both, cut the supply lines to Toretsk and launch multiple strikes towards Toretsk from different directions. And that is very consistent with the way in which the Russians now attack these fortified towns. Anyway, speaking of other fortified towns, we've had less news today from Chasiv Yar itself, but we have received news. We received news yesterday that the Russians have now entered and are in the process of capturing the village of Grigoriivka, which is located to the north of Bogdanovka and Kalinina, two villages to the northeast of Chasiv Yar, and all of these villages, Grigoriivka as well, east of the Seversky Donetsk aqueduct. Now, as to this, the core explanation for this operation, I would suggest again that the principal reason for it is to make sure that there are no problems on the flanks, to make sure that the Russian advance towards Chasiv Yar, now that the Russians look like they're close to capturing the central part of Chasiv Yar, that as the Russians are able to start to advance westwards to the high-rise building area, to places like the suburb of Mikhailovka, which is located to the southwest, that as the Russians do all of these things, their flanks in Chasiv Yar are protected so that they can advance on a broad flank. That's my own view, my own assessment of what this is all about. And further north still, but not that far away, in Seversk, in the area of Seversk, there are now reports. The Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed that after the railway station of Vemka was captured a few days ago, the village of Vemka, very close to Seversk itself, from the south, has been captured also, bringing the Russians again very close to Seversk, though again, it may be that an operation to capture Seversk is still some way away. Lastly, Group of Forces North are telling us that they're on the attack, both in Kursk and in Kharkiv region. The Ukrainians, according to them, have been making more attempts to try to slow the advance in the area of the high-rise buildings, to no success, supposedly. And Group of Forces North also say that in the Kursk area, they're gradually pushing the Ukrainians back. Supposedly, according to Group of Forces North, we continue to advance in the Korenovo area. Several positions of the Ukrainian armed forces have been captured in heavy fighting. In addition, 2 attacks on the settlement of Olgovka and 1 on the workers' settlement of Korenovo, with up to 55 enemy troops and 4 armoured vehicles have been repelled. Enemy losses amounted to 30 troops. And they also say that fierce fighting continues in the north to the north of Suja. And rather amusingly, they say that the Ukrainians attempted to attack in the Bermuda Triangle area. Now, I'm going to suggest that this is probably the area of Malaya Loknia Ruskaya and Cherkasskoye Porechnoye, all of these places, these villages to the north, east of Suja, where the Ukrainians have made one attack after another over the course of many weeks, and where they have been consistently repelled with very heavy losses. And apparently the Russian troops in the area have started to refer to this area as the Bermuda Triangle, the place where the Ukrainians enter and then disappear. They don't come out. And anyway, whatever. The Russians now have the initiative again in Kursk, and they're gradually pushing the Ukrainians back. So, all across the battlefronts, the Russians continue their advance. The most dramatic news, of course, continues to be in the Pokrovsk area. Although if Vuhledar falls over the next couple of days, that will be big news also, perhaps more for its psychological effect, but also because of the way in which it opens up possibilities for further advances. So there we are. That is, so as of today, the situation on the battlefronts. We're probably going to be looking at a very intense series of battles over the course of September. Probably the Russians are going to launch an assault on Pokrovsk sometime around mid-September. My guess is they will want to clean up in Selydove first, and maybe Ukrainsk and these other villages. They'll want to secure the main road to Pokrovsk from Donetsk city. That will provide them with secure logistics. They have the railways that they've been using to provide them cover. But sometime in September, the real crisis, the biggest crisis Ukraine has faced in the war up to now, actual military crisis, will start to unfold. Now, I said at the beginning of my program that events are moving so fast that I get the sense that people in Ukraine, in Russia itself, and of course in the West, are losing their grip, their political grip, their political understanding of what is happening, and that at a time when perhaps getting some kind of negotiations on track ought to be the key priority, nothing like that appears to be taking place, at least not from the Western side. Again, to repeat once more the point I made at the start of this program, the meeting of Jake Sullivan with Yermak, at which the national security advisors of the Prime Minister of Britain, the President of France, and the Chancellor of Germany were all present, was probably more than anything else a meeting intended to impress upon the Ukrainians, upon Yermak himself, that the situation is now so bad that some kind of political or diplomatic track must urgently be followed. But there is no clear idea as to what that is. There's been no proposals from the Ukrainians whenever the topic of negotiations comes up, even after all the long, arduous process of trying to get some kind of negotiations going, which seemed to be promising in the late summer before the Kursk operation was launched. Ultimately, what always happens is that the Ukrainians revert to the Zelensky peace plan, which requires a complete unconditional pullout by the Russians from all of Ukraine. Now, first of all, I should again express my debt of gratitude to the British historian Jeff Roberts, or rather I should say historian. He's actually from, I think he's ultimately from Britain, but he was based in Ireland as a historian, but anyway, extremely fine, brilliant historian. And he is also somebody who regularly distributes or circulates interesting articles about the Ukrainian conflict. And he's just provided me with a link to one by Anatol Lieven. Anatol Lieven has been one of the most interesting commentators about the war. He's not, I think it's fair to say, much of a fan of Russian President Putin. He tends to accept a large part of the Western narrative about Russia and about Putin himself. He has always, however, been deeply skeptical, in fact not just skeptical, critical of Western insistence on bringing Ukraine into NATO. He has been harshly critical of Western diplomatic failures in the lead up to the conflict in Ukraine. And he's been apparently to Moscow and he's met with some Russians who he describes as establishment figures. And he's written a very interesting article about this. And the title of the article is How the Russian Establishment Really Sees the War Ending. And the article has, of course, appeared in Foreign Policy. Now, I have certain comments to make about this article before I proceed. And these relate to a recent live stream that we did on the Duran with the commentator, that extremely astute commentator on Russian affairs, John, and I should say veteran commentator on Russian affairs, John Helmer. And Helmer has said that there is tension within Moscow, as by the way you would expect in any great city and any great capital, between those who want a more hardline resolution of the war, the people who are gathered within the defense ministry, the general staff, people like Medvedev, the Security Council. They basically want to press on until the final complete capitulation of Ukraine, and a more moderate, accommodating faction, people who want to see the war end, who are prepared to accept some kind of negotiated outcome to the war, and who have been focused mostly on what might be called Istanbul Plus. The proposal, in other words, that Putin made a few months ago when he addressed the board of the foreign ministry in Moscow. That was back in June. And Istanbul Plus basically was Istanbul. All of the proposals that the Russians and the Ukrainians appeared to have agreed in Istanbul, plus Ukrainian acceptance, or at least withdrawal from the four regions, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson, and of course Ukraine no longer seeking military recovery of Crimea. Now, Istanbul also, of course, required Ukraine to become again a neutral state and to accept limits on its armed forces and to pass laws to purge itself of the influence of that extreme ideology of the 1930s, which, out of sensitivity to this platform, I generally don't like to name, but which all of you who follow the war in Ukraine know what I'm referring to. Anyway, that was Putin's proposal, and the people that Anatol Lieven spoke to are clearly people who belong to this moderate faction. because all of them, all of them appear to want essentially a peace based on Istanbul Plus. He did say that there is a small minority amongst the people that he spoke to who believe that Russia should fight for complete victory in Ukraine, which would include the annexation of large new areas of Ukraine, or the creation of a client regime in Kiev. A large majority of the people he spoke to wanted an early ceasefire roughly along the existing battle lines. There is high confidence that the Ukrainian military will never be able to break through and reconquer significant amounts of Ukraine's lost territories. And he then goes on to say, as far as I can make out, Kursk, the incursion into Kursk has not changed basic Russian calculations, in part because the Russian army continues to make significant progress in Donbass. And the idea, they also say that he has detected little sense of genuine respect for Putin as a military leader, though there is much more widespread approval of his government's economic record in resisting Western sanctions and rebuilding Russian industry for war. And then he's told that the key reason his contacts desire a compromise is that they believe that Russia should not and probably cannot attempt to capture major Ukrainian cities like Kharkiv by force. They point to the length of time, the high casualties, and the huge destruction that has been involved in taking even small cities like Bakhmut in the face of strong Ukrainian resistance. And they seem to be prepared, according to Sullivan, to trade territory in the Kharkiv region for territory in the four regions which the Russians have not yet captured. And Sullivan then says, underlying this attitude is the belief that to create a Russian army large enough to attempt such a complete victory would require a massive new round of conscription and mobilization, perhaps leading to the kind of popular resistance now seen in Ukraine. The government has been careful to avoid conscripting people from Moscow and St. Petersburg, and to pay large salaries to soldiers conscripted from poorer areas. Neither of these limits could be maintained in the context of full mobilization. So, according to this view, the Russians only want relatively limited territorial gains. The four regions, in effect, though some of the people that leave and talk to appear to be prepared to accept less than the complete territory of the four regions. So Kherson City and Zaporozhye City, they might not particularly want, but they want a ceasefire essentially along those lines. But they are unanimous on certain things. Among my contacts, there were no differences on the subject of Ukrainian neutrality, which everyone declared essential. So they all want Ukraine to become neutral, to remain outside NATO. These are, bear in mind, the moderates. They talk about the kind of guarantees that Ukraine might receive, but certainly it must not join NATO. And they also want some moves to ensure that Ukraine at some point remain, at any rate, reasonably friendly towards Russia. Now, these are the moderates. These are the supposed moderates. They don't want to occupy the whole of Ukraine. They don't want to fight and win the war to the last battle. They want a peaceful settlement. with Russia retaining all that it has, perhaps getting the whole of the four regions, but insisting on Ukrainian neutrality, which, even for these more moderate Russians, is an absolute precondition. Now, that then brings us to the question that Eve Smith at Naked Capitalism has been repeatedly asking. What if Ukraine rejects that? What if it continues to insist on NATO membership? And it also brings us to the same point that was made by John Helmer in the live stream that we did with him. What if Ukraine signs a document saying that they will remain a neutral state and then goes back on it and applies to join NATO? What do the Russians do then? A point apparently being repeatedly made by the hardline faction in Moscow. So what then? What happens? What happens in that case? Well, even this group of relative moderates then accept that things will have to proceed towards a final, a different outcome. While Putin might accept that what he would regard as a compromise now, everyone with whom I spoke in Moscow said that Russian demands will be determined by what happens on the battlefield. If the Ukrainians can hold roughly their existing line, then it will be along this line that an eventual ceasefire will run. But if the Ukrainians collapse, then, in the words of one Russian ex-soldier, Peter and Catherine are still waiting. And Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, between them, conquered the whole of what is now eastern and southern Ukraine for Russia. And anyway, there we are. So that is, it seems to me, increasingly the situation that we see, because maybe we're not yet at the point of a total Ukrainian collapse. And bear in mind, by the way, that Sullivan apparently was in Moscow and spoke with all these establishment figures, who, to repeat again, appear to have been moderate establishment figures before Ukraine's Kursk offensive started, which means that he must have spoken to them mostly in July. Now we're starting to see in the area around Pokrovsk what is beginning to look increasingly like the early stages of precisely that collapse which that Russian soldier was talking about. And of course, he spoke about Peter and Catherine still waiting, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, who between them conquered the whole of what is now eastern and southern Ukraine for Russia. My own view is that events are going to take a further course. If there is a Ukrainian military disaster around Pokrovsk, and I don't see myself how it can be averted, then, and especially after Kursk, the pendulum is going to swing even further in Moscow towards the very hardliners. I would also say this about Putin himself. I think that he has been a conflicted man. On the one hand, I think mentally, intellectually, he understands that his allies, his friends, the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, the Arab states, have up to now wanted to see a compromise peace. I think he's understood very well the enormous challenges in absorbing most or all or large parts of Ukraine into Russia. I think that for that reason, as he has shown repeatedly, he has been prepared to negotiate, and of course he's also got to keep in mind the views of the sort of people that Anatol Lieven spoke to, who are, of course, and this is important to remember, the sort of Russian establishment figures who would be prepared to talk to him, to talk to a Western commentator who is ultimately part of the mainstream and who is a critic, a frequent critic of Putin and of the Russian government, and who supported the imposition of sanctions against Russia. So Putin's mind, if you like, has accepted the arguments of this moderate faction from time to time. But my own sense is that his visceral feelings very much would prefer to see the war to be conducted towards a victorious conclusion, to the fall of Kiev, to the recapture of Odessa, and Anatol Lieven accepts that there are Russians who want to see Odessa brought back under Russian control, though he believes, I think wrongly as it happens, that the Russian abandonment of Kherson basically puts Odessa out of reach. I don't think that is correct. But anyway, I think that viscerally, that is what Putin would like to see. He would like to see a complete reunification of what he sees as the historic Russian land, the territory that is core Russia, bringing together ultimately the three nations, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, and the Russians, back into the motherland, into a Russian Union, where no doubt he would nonetheless still expect them to maintain their own distinct identities. So I think that if his head sometimes has leaned towards the moderates, his heart is basically with the hardliners. And with every advance that happens, with every further move westwards, he's going to feel that he doesn't really need to make the kind of concessions to the Ukrainians, to the Western powers, to the moderates that he has to deal with in Moscow, that he might otherwise need to do, because the military situation, as that Russian officer, ex-officer who spoke to Lieven, has said, as with every Russian advance, Peter and Catherine, and by the way, Peter's father, Alexei Mikhailovich, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, who brought Ukraine, at least central Ukraine, and Kiev itself under Russian control, they're all waiting. So, there it is. I think that if there's going to be a negotiation, it has to happen soon, because so long as the Ukrainians refuse to negotiate and refuse to compromise on their core issue, which is Ukraine's NATO membership and its engagement with the West, there cannot be peace. And I think that so long as there is a government in Kiev which appears to hanker for that outcome, the Russians will always be uneasy and will never accept any promise the Ukrainians make as having any substance to it. So, I'm going to suggest, not for the first time, that Jake Sullivan hurry up and if he wants negotiations to take place, he does that which his president has previously rejected and contact the Russians himself and essentially begin negotiations with them. If he can't do that, then maybe his successors can. The president's successors can. But bear in mind, they won't be in place before the end of January. And given the speed of events, it's highly likely that by then the situation will be such that even Putin will see no need for negotiations at all. Well, this is where I end my program today. I mentioned the three national security advisors of Britain, France and Germany attending the meeting with Sullivan. Tomorrow I do hope to touch on the situation in Germany and France. We have important elections today in Germany, which it's perhaps well to wait to see what the outcome of those elections will be before discussing the politics in Germany. But anyway, in the meantime, this is where I end my program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And you should also remember, please, to check out our shop where you'll find great things that you will no doubt love to have. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.